Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to this session for the NCFE Digital T-Levels. And today we'll be looking at the core exam papers and strategies to prepare your students. So this session today will include an overview of the core exam papers, then some general tips for preparing your students, followed by some exam paper specific tips. So this includes advice for addressing the different question types and guidance on some alternative approaches to the exams, which can actually benefit students. First, just going to begin with some quick introductions. My name is David Kiernan, and I work in the provider development team at NCFE. And I support providers with the delivery of our qualifications, the structure, understanding the assessments, and anything related to teaching and learning, as my own background is also teaching. I'm also joined today by David Seddon, our digital subject specialist. I'll let him introduce himself now.
Thanks, David. Hi everybody and welcome to the session. Just before we get started, just a bit about me and my background. I've been with NCFE now for getting on for about 18 months. Prior to this, same as David, I've got a teaching background as well. I worked in further education college for around about the last 20 to 25 years. And through the time there, I've worked with delivering and managing computer science programs. That's in both further and higher education, as well as digital apprenticeships. And as far as T-levels are concerned, I've been working with those since they started early development. Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. And it is also worth noting that even though we will be discussing the assessments today, it's important to note that I've not been involved, and neither has David said neither, with these assessments or their development, as this would be a conflict of interest since we're supporting providers directly like yourselves. So we'll begin with an overview first of the core exam papers. Now, I'm sure the majority of you are aware of where to find your T-level qualification information, but if you're not, then it is found on the NCFE website. You can then search for your digital T-level and you can find the specification on that page, sample assessment materials, teaching resources, and more. So here is the core content, which is broken into the knowledge content, which consists of those 12 root elements, plus the 3 additional elements if you're doing the digital support services T-level, and the core skills that students will need to demonstrate. And the core assessments are made up of 2 subcomponents. So 2 exam papers, which are designed to assess the student's knowledge, and an externally set skills assessment called the Employer Set Project. And it's called this as the tasks themselves have been developed in conjunction with employers to help make them as occupationally realistic as possible. The core assessments will be available in the summer and autumn terms, with the core exam papers being in June and December. And they are graded A* to E and U or ungraded. And when students sit the core assessments for the first time, they need to sit both subcomponents in the same assessment series. So all of the core content can be assessed together. Retakes, though, they can be the exam papers only or the Employer Set Project only, and it is their best grade that carries forward. As for the exam papers, if students are retaken, they must retake both exam papers, paper A and paper B. Now, one thing that's important to note though, at this current time, Ofqual are consulting onto whether to keep that first sitting rule of the core assessments and exploring the possibility of being able to sit the Employer Set Project and core exams separately, even if it's the first attempt. So that's for those of you who are watching this recording. Please ensure that you do check the latest guidance for any developments in this area. And there's one other part of the technical qualifications that I want to highlight, which is the General Competency Framework. And this lists the English, Maths and Digital Skills competencies that students will also be taught. Again, the focus is for students to have that threshold competency for the job role they're going into. And the English and maths competencies are also assessed by the exam paper. And these competencies are embedded within the specification, but it would be useful to be aware of these and develop them further with your students whenever possible. So the exam papers address the knowledge content, with paper A addressing the 6 elements shown, and paper B addressing the remaining 12 elements. And for those delivering digital support services T-level, paper B will have an additional section which will assess the 3 pathway elements. The exams can be taken as traditional paper-based assessments, or an on-screen option is available too. So do consider what is best for your students. And you will find sample papers on the qualification page, including an example of what the on-screen assessment would look like. You'll also find the past exam papers, so from the summer 2022 and the autumn 2022 just gone, mark schemes, and the Chief Examiner's report. And these are all in the assessment tab of the qualification page. And both digital paper A's are 2 hours long, but for paper B, digital business services is 2 hours and digital support services is 2.5 hours. And this is due to that additional pathway content for digital support services, or DSS. Now, the exam papers will consist of a mix of multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and extended response questions. And the papers are designed to assess these 3 assessment objectives. So assessment objective 1, or AO1, is all about the recall and demonstration of knowledge. AO2 is about applying their knowledge to different scenarios, situations, contexts, etc. And then we have the highest demand objective, AO3, being able to analyze and evaluate. Now, some questions might be brand new scenarios or situations that you've not explicitly taught the students, but they would have the required knowledge to use and apply in that given situation. Now, the latest sitting of these core assessments happened in December 2022, so December just gone. And here are the grade boundaries for the exam subcomponent, which can be found in the Chief Examiner's report. For easiness, I've also converted the raw mark required in the assessment into a rounded percentage. And so we can see that just over half the responses needed to be correct for a C grade. So 50% for digital business services for a C, 55% for digital support services. Do remember that grade boundaries can change from one assessment series to another. So these may not be the same grade boundaries for the upcoming summer series, but it should hopefully serve as a useful guide when it comes to measuring students' performance. And for formative assessment purposes and performance measurement purposes, what I would usually do as a teacher is I might add maybe between 2 to 5% onto the recent grade boundaries for making internal judgments about students, just to account for that possible increase in grade boundaries with the latest series. Not necessarily will happen, but just to be safe if you're trying to make predictions for students. We're now going to have a look at some things you could do during your lessons and the delivery of the T-level. So I'm just going to run through some formative assessment activities and how they might be used or adapted for the T-level specifically. I'm not going to go through each assessment method, but just highlight some of these and their benefits. And obviously, test and exam style questions, they're the obvious one, so do use those sample assessment materials. But I'd also encourage and suggest that students write their own questions and mark schemes instead of you, the teacher, if you were trying to come up with extra questions yourself. And then peer marking and self-assessment activities could be used to reinforce their knowledge and understanding. and do have a range of like discussion-based activities that can also allow for peer support and peer learning, and can also help to embed some employability skill development as well, being able to teamwork, work together, communication, and presentations can often be good practice as well. And for the employer step project or for the occupational specialism assessments, that's one of the requirements often for students to do some form of presentation. So as any practical tasks or role play activities that you could do for assessing student skill development. And even communication as well. It's not limited just to written communication, but there's verbal communication too, such as interview tasks and so on that occur. And what might be more supportive in development is using case studies and scenarios to help achieve this as well. And it's often safer to review what someone else did wrong than what the student themselves did. And this could be useful to expose students to like different contexts than their current learning experiences are offering. So providing them with different scenarios and examples from outside their current work or industry experience, which can also help, again, when it comes to like the employer set project and occupational specialisms, which are all scenario and context based. And that last group of bullet points there are not so much about the type of method and relate to the format or tool that could be used. As there's a wide range of different platforms and programs that are free to use and can be a bit more engaging for students. Now, ongoing assessment, especially formative assessment, is something that would be useful to actually plan explicitly into your delivery. Now, you may be used to this type of planning if you've delivered similar like academic style qualifications, I suppose, that have terminal assessments. But for those most accustomed to, I suppose, more traditional vocational course, where there can be ongoing coursework that's gradually built and assessed over time, this might be quite different, as the T levels are assessed only during set assessment dates or windows. So having ongoing assessment can provide you with valuable information on the student's level of knowledge and skills, and allow any interventions to be put into place. So the first key assessment will be that initial assessment period, determine the student's current level of knowledge, skills, attributes, their capabilities to be successful in the T level. And then other assessment points during the year, they'd be up to you. So this might be every half term with an increase in formative assessment activities prior to any of the live assessment windows. But regardless of the time frame you choose, by planning them into your delivery, they'll be a focus of your T level delivery rather than like an after consideration. Now, the two most effective strategies to improve students' achievement, according to a meta-analysis by Donlosky, are active recall, such as practice questions or skills-based activities, and spaced repetition, so revisiting or asking questions on a topic after a period of time has passed. So getting students to answer questions from previously covered content periodically can be very useful. But again, let's take some pressure off you as the teacher and have the students devise the questions, as research has also shown that student-generated questions also has a positive impact on achievement. Now, a quick way of doing this might be to give the students a section of the specification and get them to make AO1, AO2, and AO3 style questions. And a quick way of making an assessment objective 1, AO1, recall style question is to turn the bold statement into a question, and then the sub-bullet points being the required answers. But it certainly is more challenging to come up with scenarios, but you'd be surprised actually if you give this out to students what some of them might come up with. Another couple of examples I've included is getting students to do comparisons, or they even have to suggest the best option for what is being described. It's just describing what requirements a business might want, and then evaluating which organization type best fits those requirements. And getting students used to the different command verbs and their expectations will be useful for the live exam papers. Now, we do have a command verb document on the qualification page, and do feel free to share this with your students too. And to expand on the tip just in the previous slide, you could make a dice game from the command verbs, which students roll to determine which command verb they have to use in the question that they have to write. So this might be useful for revision as well. Or you could even have some different questions prepared using these command verbs, or even ones just from our assessment materials, and then just actually have it left to chance which verb they address. So a pot with like a name question, a list question, a describe question, and students have to pick randomly from the pot which question it is they have to address, depending on which ones the dice lands on. I'm just going to hand over now to David Seddon, who's got some additional advice for us.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, you know, as we all know, I mean, formative assessment, it refers to a wide variety of different ways that we can evaluate students' understanding, the needs, the progress. You know, it helps us look at if students are struggling with theory or practical. Really, it's one of the most important parts of any effective teaching practice, as it reinforces that confidence and it builds that self-directed learning. And it's a continuous responsive mechanism that positively impacts the teaching and the learning. So, you know, it could be as simple as having open questions and answers within the technical topic, or anonymous voting within sessions. You know, make use of simple paddles, so they've got a simple yes or no mechanism, so you can quickly gauge that level of understanding. You know, I think, as we all know, digital learners maybe aren't the most vocal or the most interactive all the time. So that using that kind of technique to encourages participation. You know, students can quietly interact without that fear or embarrassment of talking. Starter activities, using them to assess understanding prior to the session starting, or even using it as a closing quiz that reinforces the learner's understanding. You know, use the last 5 minutes of the session to get students to write one thing that they've learned on a session and one thing that they struggle with, write it on a post-it note, and then as they're leaving the room, stick it on the wall. And at least that gives you then some idea of what went well, what needs focusing, how to work with the students to build up that level of understanding. You know, and using digital technology, you know, creating pseudocode or flow charts to help them working with set processes. If you've got the opportunity, creating simple networks or resolving network problems, you know, and it's easy to use simulation, using packet trace to take them through. As we're working through that, it's building their confidence in what the network is, it's getting them used to things like IP addresses and how the network works. Or, you know, doing DBS using online applications like Trello, where you can create Kanban style group-based activities and Kanban boards, you know, the collaborative, the recorded, the time-stamped, and they all help build that confidence with the learners and prepares them for that final assessment, because they're building up that practical activities that gives them confidence when they're talking and working with the theory content. Thanks, David.
Cheers, thank you, David. So next, we're gonna think about actually having a plan for the exam paper. That can be actually very valuable and often something that students can actually overlook. And what we're gonna do now is explore some of those benefits of planning next. So knowing which elements of the specification content is assessed in which section of the exam paper can actually be very useful knowledge to have. So paper A for both digital business services, or DBS, and digital support services, or DSS, have the same elements being assessed in the same sections. So with section A, that assesses the first root core elements 1 and 2. Section B then, assessing elements 5 and 6. and section C, assessing root core elements 7 and 9. But when it comes to paper B, there is a slight difference for DSS, digital support, in that section A will assess the pathway elements, and then the remaining exam sections will assess the root core elements and matches up with digital business services. So you can see from the overview of paper B that digital support services, section B, C, and D, they assess the same content elements as A, B, and C for digital business services. So you could actually use, depending on which pathway you're delivering, which option you're delivering, you can actually use some digital support services questions, some of those exam paper questions, which are digital business services students, and vice versa, some digital business services questions with your digital support services questions. So you have essentially a second bank of questions. The only ones that don't have as many would be just that section A of digital support services, because that would only appear in the digital support services papers. They'll never appear in digital business services. Now, you could get students to do a self-review of the different exam sections. And here's one example of how it could be done. The students have to find out which content areas the different exam sections will assess and add their own comments, such as how confident they feel on this content area. And finally, give themselves a RAG rating, G being for green or very confident, and R for red and being concerned or lacking confidence with that area. Or instead of doing this for each exam paper section, they could actually just do it for each of the specification elements, and then apply each specification area through the exam paper to know where best to begin. So just having a look overall and picking out which section. And by doing this, students will know which sections of the exam paper they're going to be most knowledgeable and confident on. And this can help to settle students into the exam and reduce any anxiety, as research has shown that does help. And even making like bespoke suggestions to your students using this information from any like formative assessment or summative assessment activities you've performed with students. You actually might have some data and evidence on how they perform in different sections to actually advise your students as well. Now, each section of the exam paper will begin with a lower demand question, with an increase in difficulty when progressing through that section. And this is by design as well. Again, research has shown that that more basic first question makes students feel less panicked and can have a nice settling effect, as opposed to beginning with a difficult question. So how can we actually use this information about the exam papers? Well, the traditional exam approach of taking just each question in turn will mean that students would experience rises and dips in the level of demand, since beginning with section A, going from low demand question to the higher ones. Then when they get to section B, they start again with low demand questions to high demand questions. So instead, students might want to take a sectional approach instead. So as the section starter questions are the lower demand questions, it might actually be beneficial to suggest students target these first. So the students would answer the first question from section A, and then the first question in section B, and then the first question in section C. And then they repeat this approach for the subsequent questions. And this again can help with students' confidence. It can also be a more efficient use of time too. Because if the traditional approach was taken, like answering the questions in order, and if the question at the end of section A, let's say, was particularly challenging for that student, then more time would be dedicated to that question, maybe leaving less time for the easier questions. And actually, because they struggled on that question, confidence could have been knocked and might actually struggle on those lower demand questions as a result. But by tackling those easy questions at the beginning of each section, and then they'll have answered those easier ones, hopefully confidence is growing now as a result, And then it's only the higher demand questions that would be remaining. And with this, students could actually just have a look and pick and choose and target those ones, those extended response ones that they feel most confident on. I'm going to hand over again to David Seddon for some additional suggestions for us.
Yeah, as David keeps saying, I mean, practice is best. You know, in any teaching session, you've got trying to include a range of questions based around the topic that you're covering at the time. You know, it helps make students confident in the approach for working with exam papers, because you know, it's that student confidence that's probably the most challenging. A lot of the students aren't used to it, and some have come through with not using much from exam practice. And doing that, they'll pick up the tips so that they can quickly help them with things like multi-choice questions. And it'll also help them improve the writing skills, you know, for the more advanced questions where you need that clear reasoning and justification. As mentioned, read the papers first, answer the questions that the students feel most confident with, you know, so they're not just jumping in, they're going through and they're picking out things that they know the answer to, or they can easily eliminate to get to the answer. And that way it'll build up the confidence and put them in the right mindset for taking that exam. And make sure students are used to looking at what marks the questions are worth, so that they can start to gauge the time that they should be spending on the responses. That way they don't waste too much time on the easier questions, and they save themselves enough time for the more extended questions. And encouraging students to have a go at a question, you know, even if they're not fully confident, especially the written questions, as there might be marks then allocated within the response that they've come up with. So it's better to write everything down rather than missing something out that could have gained them extra valuable marks later. Thanks, David.
Cheers, thank you, David, for that. We're now going to look at the 3 question types, beginning first of all with the multiple choice questions, or MCQs. So just some quick points on the MCQs. A common misconception is that they are just like tick boxes or choosing an option from a list, but they can actually appear in other forms, such as matching different options, completing a table with correct information from the options, etc. So as a result of these different formats, multiple choice questions can be worth more than just a single mark. Usually they are between, or can be up to 2 or 3 marks, but it does depend on the questions. So for example, a question might have a table with 3 rows to complete, and it might be a mark for each of the rows that are completed correctly. They generally assess assessment objective 1, the demonstration and recall of knowledge, but they can actually address higher assessment objectives too. And on this slide, we do have some general tips that you could share with your students, but I will go into each one in a bit more detail, but do encourage your students to avoid leaving MCQs unanswered. So the first thing to check is what the question is asking to be addressed, as there can be some examples which could be easily missed. So some questions can be asking for the opposite of what might be expected, and spotting these will be important, such as identifying features, principles, regulations, etc., that does not apply in a certain situation. And has the scope of the question as well been narrowed in some way, such as a question about data storage. So is it all storage types, or just physical storage or cloud-based storage? And checking for the number of options. Does it explicitly state to choose one option, or does the question say choose all that apply? And if students are unsure, then sometimes you can actually tell from how many marks available. Not always though. So like if there's 1 mark available, it's probably 1 option you choose. But as I said, not always, it depends on the type of multiple choice question. Circling and highlighting this key information as well on the actual exam paper, that is very much encouraged and will help ensure the question is correctly addressed. Another tip is to answer the question before looking at the options to choose from. And this can help to confirm the student's choice before answering. Or if the student's answer isn't one of the options available, then it should serve as a prompt to reread the question carefully. Do be on the lookout for similar options though. Got an example of what I mean here with this question shown on screen. Students could easily mix up options 1 and 2 as they both send network packets to devices, but only option 2 is the correct description for a switch. And finally, from me, even if students don't know what the correct answer is, they actually might know what the wrong answers are. So students could actually think about the question and rule out the options that definitely don't apply. And actually doing that physically on the paper itself, adding their notes directly onto it. Then there's a chance, just by considering those remaining options, having a careful reread of the question could help students to actually gain those extra marks. Just going to hand over one more time now to David Seddon for some advice on these.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's these type of questions that help build the students' confidence. So the more we can use them in lessons and sessions, the better it is. And you know, it's not easy coming up with questions, but it's easy to turn the specification into a range of different questions quite easily. For example, the ones we've got on the screen at the moment, just a small snippet from Route 5.2. For example, we could easily create a drag and drop where they match the definition to the network just from that section, or we could break that up into 5 different multi-choice questions by asking something like a LAN is a, and then get them to describe what it is. You could ask the students what LAN stands for, or you could make it multi-choice and put similar questions in so that they're getting used to that terminology. You could ask them to provide a short definition for one of them or for all of them. You could get them to compare 2 of them and then provide an example of where one would be used or where they both be used. Or you could give them an example yourself, such as it's used within an office building, and get them to then identify the network type. So coming up with the questions using the spec is quite an easy way of creating a range of questions just from the specs directly. Using them as a starting point, it means that it becomes quite easy to create a short 5-minute quiz at the start of the teaching session. So look at what you're going to be covering in the session, create some quick questions just based off the spec, and it'll help you then gauge that level of understanding before the session starts with the students. And then you could do the same quiz at the end to see the distance travelled. And it'll get the students then familiar with how the specs work and how questions might be based around that spec, so they can then use the spec as a revision guide while they're working. Any questions that you're coming up with, any tutor that's delivering on the programme, get tutors to keep all the questions they're coming up with and build up a repository of all the questions that you've got. And then you could use that as a monthly test. You know, something like who wants to be a millionaire? You know, there could be prizes if you want. If you don't want to give prizes, you could create digital badges up. And for anybody who manages to answer all the questions or get to what they call the £1 million question, they might get a gold digital badge. If they get to the 500,000, they might get silver. And if they get to 250,000, they might get bronze. It means we're not giving, you know, you're not having to create up loads of prizes, but there's just that incentive there for winning a badge to show that they've answered so many questions. I think David mentioned it before, you know, if time does become an issue, let the students create a bank of questions based on the spec. Split the students up into 3 groups, get one of the groups to create a quiz from the topics that's been covered either that week or over a couple of weeks, and then get the other 2 groups competing to see who can get the most correct answers. So it just makes it a bit more competitive, and it's letting the students do the work. And again, it's familiarising them with the specs so that they can start to see how the different topics change and how the questions evolve based on it. Thanks, David.
Cheers, thank you, David. So next up, we're going to look at the short answer questions, or SAQs. So some summary points first on the short answer questions. And generally, they are between 1 to 6 marks that are available, and they can assess any of the assessment objectives, and sometimes multiple assessment objectives in the same question. The key thing is that these are short answer questions, and the marker is looking for very specific points in the answer. And it is a waste of time to add extra information that wasn't asked for. So students should keep their answers concise and to the point, and focus on hitting all of the points they need to, and give examples if and where appropriate. Some similar tips to the multiple choice questions too, such as checking the requirements and if there's a narrow focus, etc. And some additional tips are to check the question is in one part, or is one part of 2, or one part of 3, such as having an identify part and a describe part, and noting these command verbs as well, and using some of the key terms and information given in the question too. This can help to focus the student's answer on the question requirements. And if students are just completely lost with the question, then just by identifying the specification content area and recalling and writing any key facts from the specification element, that can possibly secure marks, especially if that's like addressing assessment objective 1, AO1, like the recall of knowledge. So putting down some relevant information related to the question that might actually hit some of the AO1 marks, if applicable. So let's apply some of the tips that I've just mentioned to one of the exam questions. So let's check what the content is for this question and what the question requires from us. So Wendy, she's got a personalized jewelry business. Sales are done through her website, and she advertises in a popular social media network. And she wants her sales to increase and believes demographic data is going to be the key to this. So that's the scenario for this question, and what Wendy's position is, so what's needed from the students. Remembering, first of all, that this is a short answer question, we can see that there are 2 marks. So straight away, I'm thinking we'll need 2 key points in this answer. Students need to identify one relevant marketing tool. So that's one of the things with Wendy, one relevant marketing tool. So that's the first mark. And then describe how this tool can be used to help Wendy. And always recheck the question and use those relevant key terms to ensure the answer is focused on the requirements. Demographics and target audience might be some examples of this. And please do encourage students to circle, add notes, etc. onto the question paper too. So with these checks done, we can now focus our answer on the requirements. So a sample answer is given for you on screen, and 1 mark has been achieved, as we can see here, by naming the tool. In this case, social media analytics. Since the question context says she advertises through a popular social media network. The second mark then is for the description. How can the tool be used to help Wendy? In this case, Wendy can learn how different demographics interact with her business, which could help her target a specific audience or demographic that's more likely to buy her jewelry. So that's just a quick example there. I'm now going to hand over to David Seddon for some additional advice for us.
Thanks. Yeah, I think everybody will agree, having the time to create the questions isn't always possible. So sometimes it's using things that are quick and easy that works best for some of the teaching sessions. And pictures kind of provide that great discussion point for starting off. You know, as David mentioned before, the questions are trying to get students to explain their findings in detail and then justify that they understand what it is. So using a picture at the start or the end of a session might help to build that skill with the students. You know, provided with a few simple questions that questions that you could use with any image, so you're not always coming up with new things. You know, like the picture on the screen you could have, and get them to think about what do they think's happening in the picture, what message is the picture portraying, what assumptions are you making when you look at the picture. So just standard questions about it. And then as students start to talk about it, you can then adapt the questions based on how the students are responding, their thoughts, their feedback. You know, so they might come up with things like, you know, it's some kind of hacking picture or something. So you can then start looking at, well, what type of hacker do you think the picture portrays? Why do you think that? You know, and they might just be the way the image looks. They might start talking about what they can see, the reflection in the glasses, that type of thing. So then you can start to say, well, what kind of hacker? Does it define like a black, a white, a grey type hacker? And again, they can start to go into it, and they can start to explain why they think it's a black hat hacker, and then get them to start expanding on it. Well, what's the implication of hacking on the hacker? You know, if they got caught while they were doing it, what would happen to them? And once they've gone through it all, you can then easily link it back to specs. You know, in this case, it'd link back to root core 1.13. So then the students can see what they've picked out, and they can also then look at the specs, and that'll give them some indication of what else they could have looked at when they was thinking about that picture as well. So it's a nice, easy way of doing it without too much work. And, you know, the purpose here is that it's getting them in the habit of picking out key information and then being able to articulate it, expanding on just that multi-choice type question. You know, and using images like this, one image might mean different things to different students. So it's quite surprising how using a simple technique like this can branch out into quite a big classroom discussion, which kind of helps some of the students understand them more technical topics a bit easier. And it's a good way for you to be able to easily assess what their understanding is and their mindset and how they're thinking. And, you know, it's only the same as we can do with a case study, but obviously if we're looking for case studies, that can take a little longer to set up and prepare. And you can also use this technique to help with the extended questions that David's going to go through in the next session, in the next topic. Thanks, David.
Cheers, thank you, David. So we're on to our final question type now, which is the extended response questions, or ERQs. Now for the extended response, as the name suggests, a longer, more detailed answer is required from the students. And these questions can be 6 marks or more, but you may often find that most begin with about 9 marks. And some of these questions have independent marks available for the quality of written communication, with 3 marks being available for those questions. And all 3 of the assessment objectives can be addressed by these questions. And much of the same advice that I've given previously for the students apply here. Reading the questions, checking the scope, context of the question, but do also check for any quality of written communication marks available. In which case, care needs to be taken with the answer structure and phrasing, layout, things like that. So extended response questions are often asking for similar information, with 3 sort of more common formats occurring. And the first example being the comparison of 2 processes, systems, regulations, equipment, etc., for a given circumstance, with any response including justification for the choices made. So an example for this question is actually being shown, where students need to compare the use of a virtual computing system and a cloud computing system for the context given. A second common example is examining the use or application of a process, system, regulation, etc. in a given circumstance. Again, with those outcomes being justified. So in this example, it's about using an online questionnaire to gather data, which does include some sensitive information. And students need to evaluate the use of this questionnaire in relation to security. And then the final common example is about what happens if a change is made to a process, system, regulation, etc. for a given circumstance, with those justifications, again, always being needed. So in this example, we have a school who are planning IT upgrades and changing their classroom register from a shared spreadsheet to a cloud database. And students then, in this question, need to consider the digital security in this example. Now, you might want to suggest an approach such as the following to help students to address the extended response questions. So step one is to identify the content area or areas that the question are addressing. So that's to make sure that relevant knowledge can be used. And again, circling and highlighting on the paper those key elements is encouraged. Step two, identify the circumstances. So if it's a comparison, then what are the circumstances for this comparison? For example, comparing uses, comparing security, comparing data types or storage, etc. Step three is to check if there is a particular focus that is being asked for. For example, if security was the circumstances of the question, then check to see if there's a particular focus, such as data security, virus and malware security, etc. And if there is a narrowed focus, then the answer should revolve around that focus only. Step four is to note that command verb and to check for multiple command verbs too, such as a describe and evaluate. And finally, step five is to ensure the answer addresses all of the assessment objectives. And I'd suggest having a planning approach first. And with this, what you could do, an example is shown on screen. You could suggest that students draw a table with 3 columns. And in the first column just goes the facts about the content area in the question. The second column is to consider the specific circumstances that's in that question, and how does that circumstance or situation affect the facts, or vice versa? Do the facts impact on that situation? And then the final column is for the student's overall decision or outcome. So what's the best decision to make with those reasons given, or what determination has been drawn with justifications, etc. So let's actually put this table approach to use. It's sometimes easier to see something in action. So let's first check the content, the context, and the question requirements here. So in this question, we have a training provider offering courses lasting from 1 day to 90 days throughout the UK. And they also have distance learning in the UK and Europe. And they want to develop their intranet website. So that's the background sort of summary. Next, we have the question requirements. So in this case, it's about the benefits, and students should focus on the benefits, not the disadvantages, of cloud computing and virtual computing. From the context, we also know that the training provider will need to ensure their system works for both UK and Europe. And the command verb we can see is analyze. So it'll need to ensure the considerations they give are linked to the context and scenario information. So in that first column, just go the facts. What are the different benefits of virtual computing and cloud computing? Which doesn't need to be explicitly linked to the context, as we will come on to that in our second column. And this is where students can then pick the relevant facts and apply them to the context. So we can see here just a bullet pointed list of benefits, and that allows students to be able to demonstrate AO1, Assessment Objective 1. Then the second column, so this is where we have students demonstrate Assessment Objective 2 and apply their knowledge to the given scenario. So now the benefits that were just previously listed in that first column on the facts bit are being directly applied here to the context. And this will help to demonstrate how those properties and features are benefits for the training provider. And then our final column. So this is for students to demonstrate Assessment Objective 3, where they give their final analysis and considerations for the organization. In this case, some examples include the hardware, the software, and legislation considerations that the organization will need to account for. Now, if a question has marks for the QWC, the quality of written communication, then students won't get those 3 marks for this sort of layout. So in the real exam, if you draw those 3 columns and just do this like this, it'll get all of the marks except for the quality of written communication, assuming they're hitting every point, of course. So they won't get QWC marks. However, they would get all of the content marks. So doing this layout will help them get that. So let's have a look at those bits now. And as mentioned earlier, these marks, these quality of written communication marks, they are independent of the content marks. So students could actually have written a completely inaccurate and factually incorrect answer, but still actually gain 3 marks if the response is well written, good structure, layout, care taken with grammar and punctuation. Now this is the full banding descriptors for the QWC marks, but I've written a quick overview of these marks as well. And there are essentially 3 aspects to the QWC marks. And the first requirement being for the answer to have a good orderly flow and structure using clear, plain English. So students should consider the use of paragraphs as well to help break up sections of information. The second point is the correct and effective use of grammar. This can include simple things too, such as using commas, capital letters, and so on. And then we have our final aspect, and this is using subject-specific terminology. And using key terms from the question can actually help to demonstrate that at times too. Now, there are a few common tips and mistakes that students can actually make. So actually making them very much aware of these can make them more alert during the actual assessments. And students may have their own common mistakes that they make. And they should be a bit more self-aware of these, make sure they are, and try to devise any methods for addressing them, such as acronyms that might help prevent this mix-up occurring. And then if time allows, students should do a proofread at the end and take their reader's view and read it aloud actually in their own head and see if it makes sense and add any corrections that they might need. So that is the session today. Hope it has been useful in terms of preparing students for those assessments. If you would like to give feedback on today's session, then you can just scan the QR code there, or there is the link that you can type in for the Microsoft form. So really appreciate your feedback. I want to make sure that we provide the best service possible for yourselves and make sure we have the support that you need in place. So I would like to thank you all for viewing today's session, and thank you to David Seddon as well for his support in today's session. And from everyone here at NCFE, we would like to wish you an enjoyable and successful year.